What if the man who controlled everything suddenly couldn't control the way she made him feel? And what if one accidental moment changed everything without a single word being spoken? Jonathan Reed built an empire on precision. His world was silence, power, and perfectly drawn lines, emotion, a liability, intimacy, a distraction. Then came Mira Collins, soft-spoken, invisible. The housekeeper he barely noticed, until he opened the wrong door. One unintentional glimpse, one silent, raw collision between two strangers. What did he see that left him so disarmed? Why couldn't she forget the way his eyes held her not in desire, but in something far more dangerous understanding? And when kindness becomes more terrifying than cruelty, how do you protect the one part of yourself no one was ever supposed to touch? This isn't a love story. It's a story of undoing, of vulnerability, cracking through control, of two souls who were never meant to collide, but did and can't walk away unchanged. If you've ever believed that the quietest people carry the loudest truths, and that healing begins not with words, but with recognition, this story is for you. Like, share, and subscribe to Shining Stories for more narratives that whisper, and stay long after they end. Now, step into the silence and let the story begin. The late afternoon sun had barely slipped behind the towers of East Alder when Jonathan Reed, at 38 years old, surrendered to something he rarely acknowledged: exhaustion. He wasn't the kind of man who stopped. Meetings were timed to the minute, reports dissected down to decimal points. Rest was a word he kept locked away, next to regret and sentiment. But that day, something sharp and urgent had taken root behind his eyes, a dull thunder that had grown louder with each passing hour. Eventually, even he had to yield. His penthouse was quiet when he stepped inside, the kind of stillness that only came with great height, where the city's chaos turned to a distant murmur. Light spilled across cold stone floors, brushing the sharp angles of a space that felt more like a museum than a home. He barely glanced at the familiar main hall. His fingers loosened the top buttons of his shirt. He had planned to rest, maybe sit in silence for a while. But a problem interrupted even that intention. The lights in his private study had gone out without warning. He remembered, vaguely, that the breaker box was somewhere in the older service wing of the residence, a wing he had never had reason to step into. The woman who worked there, Mira Collins, just 24, managed that part of his world with an invisible touch. She had arrived a few weeks earlier, sent by a respected staffing agency, and had managed to become nearly imperceptible since everything was always spotless, tasks finished before they were requested. She was quiet to the point of becoming a shadow. With a sigh, Jonathan crossed into the corridor that led toward the back. It smelled faintly of lavender and furniture polish. His shoes tapped gently against the smooth marble. One door stood slightly open. He assumed it might lead to the maintenance panel he was looking for. He pushed it without knocking and walked straight into a moment he would come to relive countless times. The room was modest, a space clearly not meant for grandeur, but for rest. On the far side stood Mira, her back to him, caught in the middle of changing her clothes. The fabric of her dress hung loose in her hands, her shoulders bare and unknowing. Her body moved gently with the soft rhythm of a song she hummed under her breath, something mournful, delicate, filled with longing. For one suspended instant, Jonathan didn't move. His breath caught, his thoughts emptied. Then she turned. Whether it was the creak of the door or the sudden shift in the air, something alerted her. Her eyes met his wide, disbelieving, and filled with a raw kind of fear. She let out a small, broken gasp. Her arms flew up to clutch the garment to her chest, and her face flushed with a crimson so deep it almost hurt to witness. It wasn't modesty that overwhelmed her. It was the pure terror of being seen, truly seen, when she had no armor to hide behind. Every muscle in her body pulled inward, as if she could vanish into herself. Jonathan's own reaction was delayed, confused. Words formed in his throat and died there. No apology felt sufficient. No retreat could undo what had been broken. Without a sound, he stepped back, closed the door with aching care. The latch clicked shut, but it might as well have been a thunderclap. He stood in the hallway, the stillness around him suddenly unbearable, the pain in his head gone. In its place was something else entirely, He didn't carry away the image of her skin or her silhouette. What lingered was her expression, that jarring, soul-deep panic, the helplessness in her eyes. It wasn't just embarrassment. It was the kind of vulnerability that shouldn't be witnessed by anyone. And yet, he had, by accident. But that didn't matter. The moment had changed something in him, and he knew, even then, that no apology could ever be enough. What Jonathan had seen wasn't just skin. It was something far more fragile, something untouched, something sacred. In that single, unintended moment, he had collided with a truth so raw, so defenseless, it left a quiet bruise on his conscience. Not because of what was exposed physically, but because of what had been unintentionally shattered, a purity she never meant to show. Mira Collins wasn't the type of person who occupied the center of any room. She belonged to corners, quiet spaces, where she could do her work without drawing a single breath of attention. At 24, she bore the weight of more than just her own life. Her parents, once farmers in a forgotten stretch of South Dorset, had crossed an ocean for the promise of better. What they found instead was decades of hard labor, barely enough to keep a roof overhead in the tougher boroughs of East Alder. She was their eldest, their anchor. Every hour Mira worked in that cold, echoing penthouse was not just a job, it was a sacrifice. Each paycheck was sliced into careful portions, part sent to keep her father's struggling corner shop from closing, part tucked away to help her younger brother finish school, a hope she clung to with quiet desperation. The job offered security, a roof, a room, and stability. But it came at a price: loneliness, silence. A life spent walking through marble floors and glass walls that seemed allergic to warmth. Jonathan's home was vast, modern, and untouched by comfort. Mira moved through it like a breeze that never stirred the air, unseen, unheard. That was how she preferred it. Her shyness wasn't performative. It was embedded deep in her bones, shaped by a childhood of quiet expectations, where gentleness was praised and being too much was never acceptable. Loud voices unsettled her. Demands made her shrink inward. And romance, flirtation, the messy vulnerability of relationships, those were foreign countries she never dared to visit. She lived by rhythm and rules. Dignity was not just important to her, it was armor. Her privacy was a wall she never allowed anyone to climb. And since the day she arrived in Jonathan Reed's penthouse, his towering presence had both impressed and unnerved her. He was power personified. Wealth, precision, and control wrapped in tailored suits and clipped instructions. He rarely raised his voice. He didn't need to. The tension in the room changed the moment he entered. The oxygen shifted. Mira moved faster when he was near. And Jonathan. He didn't just thrive in that atmosphere. He curated it. At 38, he stood at the helm of one of the most formidable tech ventures in the region, a fortune built not on inheritance, but on sleepless nights and a vision that never blinked. His mind ran like an algorithm, sharp, predictive, calculating. He trusted data, not people, structure, not sentiment. The penthouse reflected him perfectly: minimalist furniture, muted colors, lines so clean they cut. Meals were delivered to his desk, often untouched. Mira prepared them, but rarely saw him eat. When she did, it was behind glowing monitors and muted phone calls from faraway cities. He did not socialize. He did not host. He did not pause. Emotion, to Jonathan, was not just unnecessary, it was inefficient. In truth, he hadn't really seen Mira until that one irreversible moment, until the accident, until her silence broke open in front of him. And now that image followed him like a whisper, not because of what had been revealed, but because it reminded him of something long buried, that there are still people in the world who have never learned to raise their voice, because no one ever made space for it. Before that afternoon, Jonathan Reed barely noticed Mira Collins beyond the tasks. She performed another silent fixture in a world he had designed for efficiency, not connection. But after stepping, uninvited, into her private space, something shifted. The days that followed unfolded like a silent play with no dialogue. The air between them became heavy with tension, not loud or confrontational, but dense with the things neither of them could say. Mira became even more intangible, if that was possible. She moved like mist, gliding through the penthouse as if her feet barely touched the floor. She adjusted her schedule to avoid him entirely. Her footsteps, once steady and soft, were now nearly imperceptible. Her gaze never lifted. Her presence became a breath, a fleeting shadow. Whenever their paths accidentally crossed, color would surge to her face, and her hands would tremble ever so slightly. Her eyes would flinch away, as if meeting his might undo her completely. She was certain it was only a matter of time before she would be asked to leave. That one mistake, unintentional though it was, would be enough to erase her place in this meticulously controlled world. Every look from Jonathan, even the neutral ones, felt loaded with silent judgment. Every polite command was, to her, a countdown. Meanwhile, Jonathan found himself deeply unsettled. His home, once an echo chamber of order and routine, no longer felt like his. Something fragile had been broken, and the pieces haunted him. He couldn't stop thinking about her expression in that room, not the physical moment, not her bare shoulders or startled gasp, but the fear, the instinctive shrinking, the way she looked like she wished she could disappear. It had carved a wound into him, not because she had been vulnerable, but because he had trespassed on something he hadn't even known he should protect. He noticed things now: the faint citrus scent of the polish she used on the furniture, the way she always added a single flower, just one from the weekly bouquet, onto the corner of his otherwise sterile desk. These quiet gestures had existed long before, but only now did he see them, and try as he might, he could not look away. He buried himself in numbers, deadlines, projections, but her presence, or perhaps the aching absence of her ease, crept into his thoughts at the worst times. During board meetings, during a midnight call with investors, even as he stood before a screen filled with global market data, her wide, frightened eyes would flash in his mind. It wasn't obsession, it wasn't desire. It was the haunting realization that he had bruised something unblemished, and somehow, that mattered more than anything he could quantify. He began to soften, though subtly. His instructions to Mira came with a quieter tone, his voice less clipped, less commanding. He caught himself watching the way she cleaned the sculptures in the hallway, her movements gentle, almost reverent, the way she straightened a book or adjusted a misaligned chair with a care that came from pride, not obligation. Then, on a late afternoon thick with tension, his mother made one of her rare visits, sharp-tongued and impatient. She scolded Mira over something trivial, a missing lemon slice in the tea. Jonathan barely had time to think. He stepped in. His voice was calm, measured, but firm as steel. "That will be enough, Mother." His mother raised an eyebrow, surprised. Mira blinked in confusion, then lowered her gaze quickly, a flicker of stunned relief in her eyes. Jonathan told himself it was about boundaries, about professionalism, about keeping peace in his home. But deep down, another feeling had stirred, something unfamiliar, something dangerously close to protectiveness. To anyone watching from the outside, Jonathan Reed might have seemed unchanged, still composed, still commanding. But inside, something delicate and disorienting was unraveling. The subtle shifts in his tone, the softened edges in his words, even his quiet rebuke of his mother's harshness, none of it brought Mira Collins peace. In fact, it made everything worse. Each rare moment of gentleness from him felt more like the tightening of a silent trap. Was he preparing her for dismissal, testing her boundaries before some final judgment? The not knowing, that quiet fog of dread, was far more suffocating than outright anger. She stopped sleeping. Food lost its taste. Her mind spun through endless worst-case scenarios. A dropped glass, a wrinkled towel, even a misplaced book could be the excuse that ended everything. The world outside her small window, once painted in dreams of new beginnings, now looked unfamiliar. The city's lights flickered like warnings rather than hopes. What used to feel like distance now felt like isolation. And Jonathan. For the first time in a long time, he was no longer certain of himself. He prided himself on clarity, on cutting through ambiguity with logic and will. But now, his thoughts returned to Mira in ways he couldn't reason through. Her trembling voice, her lowered eyes, the way she seemed to shrink every time he entered a room, as if bracing for impact. He hated that he had caused that. And yet, The moment haunted him not because of desire, but because of something harder to name. Her innocence wasn't weakness. It wasn't ignorance. It was something unfiltered, unblemished, something that had survived a world full of reasons to become hardened, but hadn't. It was unsettling. It was powerful. It was a mirror he hadn't asked for, reflecting the hollow efficiency of his own life. The string of achievements, the polished surfaces, the never-ending pursuit of more suddenly all of it felt silent, not quiet, but empty. He found himself watching Mira differently now, not like an employer watching a subordinate, but like a man trying to understand a different kind of being. He saw how she adjusted the thermostat in his study before he arrived at detail he'd never asked for, but one she had somehow noticed. How she straightened a crooked picture frame with the gentleness of someone fixing a sacred thing. How her fingertips lingered for a heartbeat on polished wood, not to admire, but to care. And still, the image of her startled, defenseless, echoed inside him like footsteps in an empty hall. It wasn't lust. It wasn't pity. It was something far more disorienting, the slow, steady dawning that he was a man encased in glass, successful, untouchable, and she had cracked the surface without meaning to. The nights grew harder. His bed no longer offered rest. Boardroom discussions blurred. Numbers lost their usual power. Even the brilliance of a lucrative merger faded when compared to the soundless memory of Mira's wide, frightened eyes. The haunting was no longer just memory. It was reflection. A confrontation with the part of himself he had ignored for far too long. And in that confrontation, something unexpected had begun to stir. There were moments brief and unremarkable to anyone else that Jonathan Reed found himself quietly holding on to. One afternoon, through a barely cracked doorway, he saw Mira Collins leaning over a struggling orchid on the far windowsill of a utility room. She touched its leaves with the kind of care one might reserve for something irreplaceable. Her brow was furrowed with quiet concern, her eyes soft with patience. No one had asked her to save it. No one would have noticed if it had withered, but she noticed. Another day, his driver mentioned something in passing that Mira had discovered a thick roll of bills left behind in the back seat, likely fallen from Jonathan's coat. She had returned it immediately, face flushed, voice quiet, and politely refused even a simple thank you note. These weren't grand gestures. There were no dramatic acts. But in their quiet consistency, they painted a portrait of something rare, a life built on integrity so natural it didn't ask to be seen. A kind of honesty that existed not for praise, but because it was the only way she knew how to be. That first, accidental glimpse of her hadn't shown him something new. It had only made him start noticing what had always been there. Her gentleness, her discipline, her goodness. It unsettled him in ways he couldn't explain. And slowly, without truly meaning to, Jonathan began to change. One morning, as Mira passed him in the hall, he caught a closer look at her, the dullness in her complexion, the shadows that gathered beneath her eyes. Without hesitation, he instructed his chef, who had always cooked strictly for Jonathan's own minimal tastes, to prepare healthy meals daily, making sure Miss Collins had access to whatever she needed. The chef had blinked at him, confused, but didn't ask questions. Jonathan didn't mention it to Mira. He couldn't. It felt too fragile, too deliberate. And maybe deep down, he wasn't ready for her to know that he was noticing at all. Another time, he overheard her speaking softly on the phone, tucked just out of view in a side hallway. Her voice, usually silent in his world, was tender and steady. She spoke of bills, of tuition, of someone back home who needed medication. She reassured the person on the other end, calm, collected, hiding what must have been worry with a practiced grace. The next morning, a sizable anonymous donation arrived at her younger brother's college, routed discreetly through a philanthropic fund Jonathan rarely used. On paper, it was charity. In truth, it was the only language he knew for apology and admiration. But this awakening wasn't about her past. It wasn't about finding out who she had been. It was about realizing, with uncomfortable clarity, who he had become. Mira's innocence wasn't naive. It wasn't fragile. It was strong in a way that didn't need to prove itself. She lived with a quiet code, unbending and untouched by the jaded calculations of the world Jonathan knew. She had made him see his own life not as a fortress, but as a prison. His drive, once his greatest source of pride, now looked more like hunger that never ceased. The loneliness he had cultivated like armor, suddenly it felt like a wound. And Mira. She remained trapped in confusion. The man who once felt like an unmovable wall was now behaving in ways she couldn't predict. A softer tone, a question about the temperature of her room, warm meals appearing in the kitchen. It didn't feel safe. It felt uncertain. Were these signs of forgiveness, manipulation? Was he preparing to speak of what had happened, or pretending it never did? Every smile he didn't give, every glance he didn't hold too long. Every silence between them carried a weight she couldn't name. So she worked harder, hid deeper, breathed quieter, hoping that if she could just become invisible again, maybe whatever this was would go away. If Mira Collins could just perfect silence, sharpen it into something surgical and exact, maybe she could undo what had been done. Maybe, if she moved precisely, spoke less, breathed softer, the moment would dissolve for him, and perhaps for herself too. But the man she once feared for his rigidity, the man who lived by timetables and numbers, had become someone she could no longer predict. Jonathan Reed, that name once echoed with control, now moved in contradictions. A softened word here, a kind gesture there. Signals she didn't understand, couldn't trust. His penthouse had transformed. Not physically, the glass still gleamed, the silence still hummed, but beneath the surface, it had become something else. A place where every corner held tension, every pause between them buzzed with things unsaid. Then came that Tuesday morning. The air already felt heavier than usual, charged with the weight of too many unspoken things. Mira had been arranging a fresh bouquet of orchids in his office, her fingers carefully placing each stem when her hand faltered. The porcelain vase slipped. It shattered against the marble floor in a crisp, echoing crash. Water rushed outward. A single orchid lay twisted in the spill. Mira froze. Her heart stopped. She stood motionless, staring down at the wreckage as if it might judge her. Her breath came in shallow gasps. This was it, the final straw. Her hands clenched at her sides. The tears gathered before she could stop them. She didn't dare look at him. But Jonathan had seen the whole thing. From his desk, he had watched not just the fall of the vase, but the quake it set off inside her. Her shoulders drawn tight, her eyes squeezed shut, her body braced, as though expecting something to break again this time, within her. And for the first time, he truly understood the depth of her fear. No reprimand left his lips, no sharp command. He rose from his chair slowly, each step deliberate, careful not to startle her more. "Mira," he said, his voice low, steady, almost tender. "It's okay. It's just a vase." She blinked, looked up. He saw the disbelief flood her expression, as if she couldn't quite register what she'd heard. Her lips parted slightly, and something fragile flickered in her eyes, a mixture of shock, suspicion, and the faintest trace of hope. I thought..." Her voice cracked. "I thought you were going to fire me." Her words spilled in a rush, uncontrolled, trembling. "You've been acting different. I didn't know if it was because of that day." She couldn't say more, couldn't look at him. And Jonathan, the man who built empires with his restraint, felt something inside him shift in a way no market crash or betrayal ever had. He stepped a little closer, but kept his distance, careful not to cross whatever fragile threshold still stood between them. "What happened," he said gently, "was my fault. I walked in without knocking. I intruded on something that wasn't mine to see. And for that, I am truly sorry." His voice didn't waver, but there was something raw underneath it. "I never meant to frighten you, Mira, never meant to make you feel unsafe." A silence hung between them, and then he added softly, "No, you're not going to lose your job. You are one of the most capable, dignified people I've ever worked with." That vase. It's nothing. At last. She raised her eyes to meet his. There was still caution there, but something else too. A reluctant, fragile kind of curiosity. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that betrayed more vulnerability than his words ever could. For a man like him, that alone was an unraveling. And though nothing was resolved in that single moment, the walls between them, once solid and sharp, had cracked. Just slightly. Enough for something human to breathe through. Yes, Jonathan Reed said, his voice hesitant at first, as though the weight of his own thoughts had slowed his speech. Then, as if deciding there was no other way but through, he continued, I have been different. Because that moment the day I saw you, it changed something in me. And not for the reason you might think. He paused, searching for a way to name what had haunted him for weeks. It wasn't your body, he said quietly, not in the way you're afraid it was. It was you, your stillness, your fear, the way your vulnerability wasn't hidden, but real, unfiltered. It held up a mirror I wasn't ready to look into. His eyes drifted to the tall window beside them, the city sprawling beneath like a sea of steel and indifference. Then, slowly, he turned back to Mira Collins, his expression softer than she'd ever seen. It stayed with me, he confessed, not in a way that should frighten you, but in a way that's made me question everything I thought I understood about myself. Mira didn't speak, not because she didn't want to, but because her breath had caught on something unnameable, an emotion rising so fast she could barely contain it. The man standing before her, once a symbol of unreachable authority, now looked almost uncertain, almost human. He wasn't deflecting. He wasn't minimizing what had happened. He was standing in it, in the shame, in the discomfort, in the unraveling. And somehow, that made all the difference. She had prepared herself for excuses, maybe even denial, but instead, he had handed her honesty. I don't know what to say, she whispered finally, her voice thin and uncertain. You don't have to say anything, Jonathan replied gently. I just needed you to know that what happened wasn't a reflection of you. It was a moment that revealed something missing in me. He let the silence rest between them, not trying to fill it, and slowly. The tension that had hung around her for so long began to release its grip, not completely, but enough to let her breathe. He wasn't trying to seduce her. He wasn't offering pity. What he offered was harder to define, a quiet reverence, a recognition of something in her that he had never seen before in anyone, not in boardrooms, not in fleeting social niceties, not even in himself. Her strength had never come from boldness or voice. It came from her stillness, from her quiet decency, from the integrity she carried like breath. For the first time, Mira looked at Jonathan without the filter of fear, and what she saw wasn't power, or coldness, or calculation. She saw loneliness. She saw the echo of her own confusion mirrored in him, and maybe, just maybe, she saw the beginning of something else, not resolution, but recognition. Jonathan, for his part, saw her not as the maid who had tried so hard to disappear, but as a woman of quiet strength who, without ever meaning to, had dismantled every illusion he held about control and distance. I want you to feel safe here, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I want you to know that this place isn't just mine anymore. Your presence, your grace has changed it, and it's changed me. There was nothing romantic in the moment, nothing scripted, just two people, stripped of pretense, standing on the fragile edge of something neither had expected. And though the roles between them remained employee, that invisible line had been crossed, not inappropriately, not intentionally, but by the sheer force of emotional honesty. And what lingered now was something gentler than fear, but no less powerful, something that felt dangerously close to care. In the days that followed, Jonathan Reed became softer, not dramatically, not in ways most people would notice, but Mira Collins did. He asked if her room was warm enough, if she liked the new set of linens, if she needed anything else for the small kitchen tucked in the staff wing. His voice, once clipped and clinical, now carried a kind of careful warmth that unsettled her more than coldness ever had. And Mira. She responded the only way she knew how, with flushed cheeks, lowered eyes, and short, murmured replies. Gratitude warred with uncertainty in her chest. What was this shift? Where was it leading? What did it mean? She wanted to believe he was simply trying to be kind, but another part of her, the part shaped by years of quiet caution, whispered that power was never free, that kindness from someone like him might carry edges she couldn't yet see. The truth was more complicated. Jonathan had begun to care, though he barely knew how to name it. What had started as a haunting had shifted into something gentler, but just as consuming. He found himself thinking of her not as an employee, but as a person, someone who moved through life with quiet strength and invisible burdens, and that terrified him. Because while he could manage empires and steer high-stakes deals, the slow ache of emotional connection was foreign territory. He didn't know how to navigate it. His gestures of concern were often awkward, his timing poor. Sometimes, under pressure, he would snap back into the old version of himself, curt, precise, distant. Those moments always left Mira reeling. The wall she had tentatively lowered would slam back up, and Jonathan would retreat into silent frustration, angry at himself for undoing what little trust had been built. Around them, others had begun to notice subtle things. The way his gaze sometimes lingered when Mira passed by. The tone of his voice when he spoke to her, not sharp, but soft, like someone trying not to break something already fragile. The whispers began on the executive floor, quiet, curious, then louder. Envy, suspicion. Why her Mira felt it, the sideways glances, the sudden silences. Even kindness from other staff started to feel tinged with judgment. She shrank further into herself, dreading each day, no longer from fear of Jonathan, but from the invisible spotlight that now followed her. She thought about leaving. Often, drafted resignation letters sat in her tablet's draft folder, untouched but not forgotten. Each time her finger hovered over send, something in her heart pulled back. Not because she felt safe, she didn't. Not yet. But because some part of her was beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, something genuine existed beneath all the confusion. Jonathan noticed. He always noticed her silences now, and so he made a choice. He dug out her initial application, the one she had submitted through the agency before she ever stepped foot in his home. There, buried in the lines about availability and experience, was a note about her goals, support for her family, a dream of returning to school. Not ambitions shouted from rooftops, but quiet hopes she carried alone. And he remembered that phone call, her voice gentle and steady, talking about medical bills and tuition. She had been carrying more than anyone her age should. So, one evening, he asked her to step into his study. Mira's heart thundered as she approached. Her mind spiraled through possible endings: dismissal, maybe, or another stilted apology she didn't know how to receive. But when she entered, Jonathan didn't look stern. He looked steady. There was no tension in his posture, no judgment in his eyes. He gestured gently to the chair across from him. "Please," he said, "sit. There's something I'd like to offer you." "Mira," Jonathan Reed began, his tone calm but laced with something deeper, almost vulnerable. "I've been thinking a great deal, not just about your work here, but about you and your future." He paused, fingers resting lightly on a folder that lay closed on his desk. The room was still, holding its breath between them. "I know you're capable," he continued, choosing each word with precision. "And I also know from observation, from listening, that you're carrying more than most people realize. Responsibilities, sacrifices, dreams you've kept quiet." He pushed the folder toward her gently. "This is a proposal." Mira looked down at the simple file, its cover plain, unassuming. Her hands remained in her lap. "At Havenstone Foundation, one of our new branches, there's a position opening," Jonathan said. "A community outreach coordinator. We need someone empathetic, organized, someone who understands what it means to serve others not from a distance, but with lived grace." He hesitated, then added, almost gently, "It comes with a significantly higher salary and a full educational grant. Any field of study, any city university, all covered. Mira's gaze flicked up not with excitement, but with disbelief. He read it immediately. "This isn't charity," he said softly, "and it's not pity. It's an opportunity you've earned through your integrity, your diligence, your quiet strength. Whether or not you take it is entirely your choice. There are no expectations, no strings." She remained still. "This place, this role," he continued, gesturing around the room, "has never defined you. I see who you are beyond the tasks. And I believe others should see that too." Jonathan made it clear if she accepted, her current position would be filled. Their connection, moving forward, would be based on whatever boundaries she set. Not him. It was a bridge, not to pull her closer, but to let her walk forward if she chose. Mira's heart thudded quietly in her chest. She hadn't expected this. Not from him, not after everything. But the offer wasn't performative. There was no pride in his voice, no undercurrent of manipulation, just a man trying in the best way he knew how to acknowledge her worth. And for the first time since that terrifying day, something warm and unfamiliar began to stir in her chest. Hope. Real. Unfiltered. Hers. No, it didn't erase what had happened. It didn't dissolve the tension or make the memory vanish. But it cracked something open, something that made her wonder if healing could, in time, be possible. And maybe this wasn't just about him making amends. Maybe it was also about her finally stepping into something she had quietly dreamed of, but never dared pursue. She didn't answer that day, but a few mornings later, her voice, still quiet but steady, met his with a simple, "I'll take it." She didn't say thank you not out of pride, but because what he had given wasn't a favor. It was recognition. And in her new role, Mira began to shine not through noise, but through gentle consistency, empathy, and the same quiet diligence she had once poured into unseen spaces. The penthouse, once a museum of cold elegance, slowly began to change too. She brought life to it in small ways, a glass jar of wildflowers on a bare windowsill, a soft throw left draped over the back of the couch, the faint, unexpected scent of cinnamon drifting from the kitchen after a long day. And through it all, something between them fragile but real began to rebuild. Not as master and maid, but as two people learning how to exist in the same story. What had once unsettled Jonathan Reed, that soft, unshakable presence of Mira Collins, had slowly transformed into something far more profound. Not obsession, not guilt, but love. Not the grand kind that shouts, but the kind that lingers quietly in the corners of a life. He had come to cherish her, not just the grace she moved with, or the calm way she carried her responsibilities, but the steady compass of her spirit. Her strength wasn't loud, but it never wavered. She became his mirror and his lesson. He learned to listen not only to what she said, but to what remained unsaid, the pauses, the care, the things she noticed that no one else ever did. And slowly, he became something else too. He celebrated her small victories, a successful community event, a kind word from a colleague, a smile she didn't know he saw. He encouraged her to consider going back to school one day, if she ever wished. Not because he wanted her to leave, but because he believed in the path she hadn't yet walked. And Mira. She saw him too. Beneath the polished exterior and structured days, she began to recognize someone unfamiliar, someone warmer, more human. The man who once seemed carved from ice now laughed quietly at her dry humor. He asked questions not for reports, but because he wanted to understand. Her fear faded, replaced by something gentler, a quiet trust. What once had frightened her, her own innocence. Her inexperience in a world filled with power had now become her strength. It wasn't fragility, it was clarity, a kind of light that had never dimmed, even when the world told her to harden. That moment, the one that had shattered his carefully maintained world, no longer haunted them. Because what lingered wasn't the accident, it was the transformation. Jonathan came to understand what intimacy truly meant, not a closeness of bodies, but a recognition of souls. Not about control or certainty, but about letting someone else's quiet truth reach places inside you that had long gone silent. And sometimes, that kind of truth arrives in the most unlikely way, a single moment, raw and uninvited, that opens a door you never meant to unlock. Months passed, seasons shifted, and one evening, with the sky outside painted in twilight and the city lights beginning their nightly flicker, Jonathan found Mira curled up on the sofa in his study, a place that no longer belonged only to him. A soft lamp lit the room. She was reading, her knees tucked beneath her, her expression calm. He sat beside her. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. She looked up, and in her eyes, there was no trace of fear, only a smile that was quiet and true. He reached for her hand, and she gave it freely, their fingers finding one another like they had always belonged that way. Beyond the window, the city pulsed and shimmered, but inside the room, there was only stillness and peace. Not because the past had been forgotten, but because it had been understood, carried gently, and finally laid to rest. Sometimes, the most powerful stories begin not with a grand gesture, but with a quiet moment no one was meant to see. Jonathan and Mira never set out to change each other's lives, but through fear, silence, and the slow unraveling of what they thought they knew, they discovered something rare, not love born from desire, but from recognition, the kind that sees straight through the noise, into the soul. In a world that often rewards volume, this was a story of gentleness, of learning to listen, truly listen, and of healing, not through perfection, but through quiet understanding. What stayed with you from their journey, was it the fear, the grace, the fragile trust? We'd love to hear what part of this story touched you the most. So don't forget to leave a comment, like the video if it moved you, share it with someone who needs something soft and real today, and subscribe to Shining Stories for more moments that speak to the heart. Until next time, keep listening for the quiet stories they often say the most.